I am a private detective up in Canada. I am also a retired police officer. Having my own detective agency is nice. It allows me to be my own boss, set my own hours, and I can accept or decline any clients I choose. Most of the common cases I see are of people thinking that their spouses are unfaithful, or their business partner is trying to swindle money out of the company. The job can be difficult, especially when I have to confirm the suspicions of my customers. But that's just part of the job. Being up in Canada, we do get our fair share of missing persons. We do get a lot of tourists coming by trying to camp and hike in the woods nearby. If you don't know what you're doing, or you don't know where you are, it's very easy to get lost. People typically come to me with a missing persons case after the police had already looked into it. I am kind of like the final resort. Because of this, I typically accept the case so I don't kill people's hopes. But unfortunately, I still have to make sure I get paid regardless of the outcome. The scariest and most horrifying case I've ever encountered was 5 years ago. I remember that morning. It was cold and brisk. I pull into the parking lot at my office. There's a nice luxury car idling in the parking lot. It's 7 in the morning and my office doesn't open till 8. Most of my clients typically reach me by email or by phone. Very rarely do we actually meet face to face. I get out of my truck, walk to my office and unlock the front door. At the same time, someone in that luxury car steps out. An elderly gentleman with a nice suit jacket and hat approached me. The gentleman is easily in his 60s. We get to talking and he wants to put me on a case. Like most cases before this one, I want to hear the details before I actually accept it. The old man seemed worried about sharing the details of this case. That's never a good sign. He asked me a couple of times if I was easily spooked. I chuckled at his thought and I told him I wasn't. I had seen a lot of weird cases up to this point, but looking back, I had no idea what I was getting into. The man wanted to hire me to help find his missing daughter out in the woods. The daughter was in her mid-30s, and she was severely handicapped mentally and very violent. The old man suspected that the daughter was living out in a cabin in the woods. This cabin was inaccessible to roads, and it would require me to backpack for 2 days out in the woods. The old man warned me that the reason they stopped going to this cabin is that there was a religious cult nearby that was causing many issues. The cult was known for dressing in weird costumes while they committed vandalism and stole cattle. This cult sounded like anarchist hippies, which kinda made me laugh. The old man had finished telling me the details about the case, and I was about to decline when the man pulled out an envelope full of money. He handed it to me and I counted. It was roughly $10,000. The old man told me that he didn't want police involved. This was another red flag. The old man essentially said that he wanted me to hike 2 days up to the cabin and just make sure that she wasn't there, and if she was, that I had to bring her home. If I was able to do this, he'd pay me an extra $25,000 as a bonus. After hearing this, I obviously accepted the case. The man then handed me another envelope. This one was full of information, mostly coordinates to where I should hike in order to find this cabin. The envelope also contained photographs of his daughter. She had beautiful long black hair. You could even tell by the pictures that the woman was handicapped. I spent the rest of the day reviewing the envelope full of information. I routed my path in which I was going to take to get to this cabin. This cabin was in the middle of nowhere. This seemed really weird. How was a mentally handicapped woman able to get out to this cabin? She would definitely need help. What was this old man not telling me? Was she maybe kidnapped and brought there? Everything in my mind was telling me that this was a bad idea, but I was just so curious as to what was going on. I spent the next day preparing my backpack, and I left the day after. I arrived at the mouth of the trail early morning. The woods were dense and dark up until 10 a.m. The path was overgrown for the most part, but it was still visible. I spent the rest of the day hiking, and I somewhat enjoyed myself. If I wasn't so perplexed about this old man and what he wasn't telling me, I thought I'd be on vacation. I made camp early and I settled in for the night. Nothing really seemed out of the ordinary. I made a campfire and I had dinner. Typically the campfire drives away animals, but for some reason I felt like I was drawing something in. I then began to feel what felt like the unseen eyes of a predator on me. I was definitely being watched, but I didn't know from where or from what. I decided to put out my fire and to go back into my tent. I kept my loaded handgun nearby. I didn't hear anything that night. That's not a good thing. Typically you'll hear some bugs and animals, but I heard nothing. It was dead silent all night long. I didn't get much sleep that night. I woke up early and made some coffee in order to jumpstart my day. Once I got back on the trail, I seemed to forget what had happened the night before, and all things were back to normal. The animals and bugs were making noise again, which helped me relax. During my hike, I came across a very, very odd scene. Something I can honestly say I'd never seen before. It was this odd wooden structure made of sticks and stones. It kind of resembled an altar of some kind. My first thought was that I came across a site that belonged to the natives. Interesting, I thought. But then I remembered what the old man told me about the cult that lived in the woods. Oh boy. I kept my cool, and I just hoped that my first instinct was right, and I continued walking deeper and deeper into the woods. It wasn't too much later when I came across another odd sight out in the woods. This one clearly did not belong to any of the natives. The site that I came across was a small collection of cabins out in the woods. The cabins were clearly put together by power tools. My first thought was to go inspect the cabins and see if I could find anyone to talk to. I walked out into the open and I approached one of the cabins. The door to the first cabin was hanging on its hinge. I gently pulled on the door and the door fell over. I walked inside a few steps. I looked around and saw that the cabin was utterly destroyed. It looked as if a bear had gotten inside. I then briefly checked the other cabins and they all looked very similar. I then inspected my map and checked to see where this old man's cabin was. It couldn't have been more than an hour or so away. So I got back to it, and I got back onto the trail. By this time, it was starting to get dark. I debated whether to keep going or to stop for the night and make a campfire. Considering all the things that I saw that day, I decided it would be best for me to hide in the woods and to stay overnight. I would not have a campfire, so I would not give away my position, and in the morning, I would continue searching for the cabin and for the lost girl. Looking back, this decision to stay overnight probably saved my life. Right around 9 o'clock, I started to drift off to sleep when I began to hear a weird sound coming from the woods. The sound was rhythmic, and it sounded as if it was pretty far away. Being a detective and genuinely a curious person, I decided to go investigate what that sound was. The woods were pitch black and the trees were dense. I made sure to leave a small light on in my tent just in case I got lost. I then went off into the woods, following the sound. The sound sounded as if a large drum was being played, but when I got closer, I was able to make out some chanting. After about 5 more minutes of walking, I was able to see a light. As I got closer to the light, I was able to make out a large field. What I'm about to describe to you is very difficult. It took my mind a couple of seconds to process what exactly I was seeing. In the middle of the field was a large bonfire with people surrounding it. The people were wearing dark robes and they were chanting around the bonfire. In between the people in robes and the bonfire looked like pigs running around in circles. Mind you, I was a good distance away and I was hiding in the tree line, but something kept telling me that something was off. The pigs running in circles looked weird. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the pigs just didn't move normally. After a few minutes, the chanting stopped, and at the same time, so did the pigs. To my horror and my sudden realization, I finally figured out why the pigs looked off. It was because the pigs were people, crawling around on the dirt, wearing pig masks. Once I realized this, I decided immediately to get out of there. I tried my best to stay calm, but I was completely terrified. I slowly backed away, trying my best not to make any sound. Once I was at a comfortable distance away, I started to sprint. The whole time I was sprinting back to my tent, I had the weird feeling that I was being followed. I knew deep down that they didn't see or hear me, but I still had that feeling. Once back in my tent, I grabbed my handgun again and I turned off all my lights. Right then and there, I debated with myself whether to keep going on with the case or to turn back. Deep down, something told me that this girl I was looking for was probably already gone. There's no way that she would have been able to survive out here, let alone with these people doing who knows what out in the woods. However, like I said, I'm a very curious person, and I'm well armed. With that combination, I felt confident enough to stay and to check out the cabin just to make sure that she was actually gone. My plan was to wake up early the next morning, find the cabin, look for any sign of this girl, and get out of there before any of these cult people woke up. I admit, it probably wasn't the smartest choice, but I decided to stay. That night seemed to go on forever, and I didn't get any sleep. Again, the forest was silent, which is pretty unusual. I got up early the next morning, around 4 a.m. The only thing I brought with me was a flashlight and my pistol. I decided to leave my camp up. Carrying the extra gear would have just slowed me down, so I decided to worry about that later. I set out for the cabin. The morning was dark and the forest was pretty dense still. The trail I took passed by the open field that I saw last night. The field was empty, but I did see smoldering ash where the bonfire was. I passed quickly and continued my journey to the cabin. After what felt like an hour, I finally arrived to the man's cabin. The cabin was more like a house, and it looked to be intact for the most part. I approached the door and tried the handle. The door was unlocked, so I entered. I made sure I had my pistol drawn, and I made sure to be quiet because I didn't know exactly what I was going to find. The possibility that the cult members lived here now was pretty high, so I made sure to make my presence not known. I examined the bottom floor. There were a few items left out that looked like someone was actually living here, but who? The cabin had a second story, so I hesitantly went up the stairs. That's when I heard it. Someone was crying. By this time, the sun was starting to rise. The visibility was starting to clear, and my cover of darkness was now fleeting. I wanted to be in and out while it was still dark, so I made sure to hurry, but also stay quiet. I walked down the hallway to the room that had the crying. I slowly opened the door, and I was completely surprised at what I was looking at. Inside the room, on the bed facing away from me, was a woman. She had long dark hair, much like the girl in the picture, and my heart skipped a beat. I tried to grab her attention by calling out to her, but she just kept crying. That's when I noticed it. The crying seemed off. The crying kept repeating in the same pattern, as if it was a recording of some kind. I quickly walked into the room, touching her shoulder. The woman turned out to be a mannequin, and on her lap was a recording of the crying. This was a trap. My heart sunk into my stomach. I then heard what sounded like a four-wheeler off into the distance. It sounded as if it was getting closer. Instead of running out of the house exposing myself, I decided to hide in the closet. The four-wheeler pulled up to the house, and it sounded like 3 men entered the cabin. I had my pistol drawn, pointing at the closet door. I could hear the 3 men talking downstairs, although not clearly. They were talking loudly, and they seemed upset. The 3 men then made their way upstairs. I could hear them much more clearly, and it sounded as if they were looking for someone. I assumed this someone to be me. The men then entered the room I was hiding in. One of the men was talking with someone else on a walkie-talkie. The man on the walkie-talkie said that he found my tent, but I wasn't inside, and that I couldn't be too far. The man then spoke into the walkie-talkie, saying, "Don't worry, we'll get him in the woods." The 3 men then finally left, though loudly, and they took off on the four-wheeler, leaving the mannequin and recording still playing. I waited in that closet for an hour. I wanted to make sure that whoever it was at the house was gone. By this time, the sun was completely up. I realized at this point I was not able to go back the way I came. I would have to take a detour about 5 miles out and circle back around back to the trail. This would cost me some very precious time and energy. But it would be a small price to pay not to be spotted by these people. I slowly left the closet, making my way downstairs into the doorway. The house and the nearby woods seemed to be empty, so I slowly left the house. I took off on a different path, leading me back. Like I said, the path back would be longer, but it would be different, making it much more difficult to track me. It was more than likely that these people were looking for me in the woods. I'm not exactly sure what they wanted with me, but I didn't want to find out. The next 2 days hiking back were terrible. I didn't have any food or shelter, and I tried to limit my stops to only 20 minutes. There were a couple of times in the woods I heard very loud squealing. I'm pretty sure the squealing I heard didn't come from actual pigs, but rather those people. Whenever I heard those sounds, I made sure to hide and stay out of sight. The squealing sounds would eventually fade off into the distance, and I would slowly get back to hiking. The nighttime was probably the worst. I would try my best to hike without my flashlight, but it would get to the point where it was near impossible, so I would just sit and rest. But I made sure to never fall asleep. After what seemed like forever, I would eventually make it back off the trail and back to the parking lot in which I parked my truck. I never did see that client that hired me for this job. I am pretty positive that he was a part of the cult that I saw out in the woods. I think that he tried to hire me to lure me out into the woods, either as a sport for his cult members, or to have me join them. Either way, the thought is pretty spooky. A couple of weeks later from this case, I did get a package. There was no return address, but I'm pretty sure it came from the old man. Inside the package were 2 items. The first item was a pig mask, much like the ones I saw the people wearing out in the woods. The second item was a note card with one word on it: Lucky.